Okay, before we continue, I just want to mention for the sake of the recording, that which you mentioned yesterday after the class. My father reminded us that that which we said yesterday about eating before Yom Kippur, on the day before Yom Kippur being considered as if one fasted on Yom Kippur, and we explained that it's because one brings the sanctity of Yom Kippur into their eating. That is the deeper or Kabbalistic explanation. The simple explanation, as it actually explains, is because in order to fast, one needs to eat, and therefore the preparation itself is considered part of the fasting, just on a simple level. But this deeper explanation that we gave, that the idea is that the sanctity of Yom Kippur be brought into the daily life of eating, is related to the discussion just before it, in which we talked about the obligation to add to Shabbos and Yom Tov by bringing it in early and taking it out late, indicating our desire that the holiness of Shabbos and Yom Tov spill over into the weekday. And that's true even on the literal halachic level of understanding this halacha. The idea is because we want to demonstrate that we are voluntarily increasing to holiness and not just waiting for the day to happen because God so decided that it happens. Okay. Now we get to this section where the Gemara discusses, again, I mentioned this yesterday, that we already learned this from the Shulchan Aruch, but here's the Gemara from where the Shulchan Aruch got this halachas. So it is Pei Aleph Amud Beis, 81b, right in the middle of the page. The line starts the word Ki'ilu, and the second to last word after the colon is Achal Eichlin. See it? Achal Eichlin she'ein ruin la'achila. So in between the two sets of colons, is the Gemara quoting the Mishnah as it always does before it begins the discussion on that passage in the Mishnah. So the Mishnah stated that if one ate food that is not fit to be eaten, one is not liable for punishment for having eaten on Yom Kippur. As mentioned before with respect to someone who eats less than the required amount, this does not mean that one is allowed to. It only means that one is not culpable. All right, we have to reiterate that distinction. It's forbidden to eat anything. The question is only whether one is culpable for the punishments that are associated with that. And the first condition, as we mentioned, we discussed at length previously, is the amount one eats or drinks. And here we're talking about that the quality of the food one eats has to be such that it is a normalized eating experience. If it's not, even though it's forbidden, one is not culpable. So the Gemara gets into some details regarding that. Amar Rava says, Kas pilpili, a cup or ground up to chew. Right, sorry, I mentioned before, Kas kashin also said that. Yeah, to eat. Pilpili is pepper, like the peppercorns. The Yom Kippur on Yom Kippur potter is exempt. Again, forbidden but exempt because this is not normal food, normal eating. Kas zan gevila, someone who chews or eats ginger. The Yom Kippur on Yom Kippur potter is also exempt. Okay, so pepper, ginger, and for that matter, all forms of spices don't count as actual food. As mentioned, I think mentioned this before with respect to meat and salt, and even though salt itself isn't an edible food, but when salt is eaten with meat, the salt can combine with the meat to make for the right amount because that is the proper way of eating it. We had this, where did we have this about someone chewing gum? We said that it was forbidden. No, sorry. No, is someone culpable for that? What did we say about this? We discussed this. Sorry? Right, we discussed it with respect to eating desserts. If he's chewing and spitting out, then it's not exempt but forbidden. So I imagine the same thing would be applied to mouthwash. Isn't that what we discussed? We learned this in the Shulchan Aruch. I don't think we learned in the Gemara. We learned in the Shulchan Aruch, not in the Gemara. Right? Okay, but here we're talking about spices. So the same rule that we said with salt, in that even though salt in and of itself is inedible, and therefore one who just took a spoonful of salt forbidden but exempt. The same thing with but if they ate that salt together with meat, then the salt can combine with the meat to push one over the threshold of culpability in terms of size, in terms of volume. The same thing is true of these spices as well. Eating them plain, it's forbidden but exempt. But eating them in the way they're supposed to be eaten, with some sort of dish, would add to the measure of volume for culpability. Okay, but the Gemara doesn't qualify yet here what type of pepper and what type of ginger. It just states pepper, one who eats it is exempt, and ginger, one who eats it is exempt. And if the Gemara says Mesei, I'll challenge this. I'm challenging this from a source greater than the one speaking. The one who spoke is Rava, a sage from the Gemara's era, and we're about to quote a Mishnaic age text, and therefore the question is introduced, the challenge is introduced with the word Mesei, which is always a quote from a source greater than the one speaking. Meir would say, from that which the verse says, the arlasem arlasai es perioi. So this is a verse, as you can see on the left, where there it says, because when you come to the land, when the tatam called Eitz Michael, and you will plant all kinds of trees that provide fruit. Varlatam arlasai, and you shall leave its growth as period of its fruit, Shalosh for 3 years. It shall be untouched. Lo yechol, do not eat it. So this is the verse commanding to leave edible foods untouched, edible trees untouched for 3 years. When in the 4th year can one harvest their fruit, and then it has to be taken. This other thing has to be done with it, has to be taken to Shleim, and then finally can be eaten. But this is the prohibition against eating fruit that's grown in the tree for 3 years. Now, the way the verse says it is, you shall leave it untouched, like arla, arla is the same word used to describe the foreskin, meaning it's something that's left as is. So you shall leave the fruit as is for all this time. But it says, as period, it's fruit. And therefore, a mayor comments and says, Any adesh eitz maichel? Do I not know that we're talking about a tree that bears fruit? Or a tree that bears edibility? You just said leave the fruit alone. So why does the verse have to, why would the verse introduce it by saying, when you come to the land and you will plant trees that will make edibility, that will provide food for you? It's redundant. When you tell us to leave the fruit alone, I know you're talking about a tree that makes fruit. So you don't have to tell me that I planted trees that provide edibility. It's redundant. So what's the verse coming to tell us when it says a tree that bears edibility? That's literally the translation. I'm saying the literal translation specifically. Eitz Michael, a tree that bears edibility, which we'd assume means fruit. And therefore it's redundant to say, leave the fruit alone. Or just say, leave the fruit alone and don't tell us you're talking about a tree that makes edibility. They're one and the same. So explaining their mayor, the verse is coming to tell you that there is a kind of tree which is incorporated within this prohibition, whose the tree itself, the wood itself, tastes like the fruit. So when it says a tree that provides edibility, it doesn't mean a tree that provides fruit that you will eat, but that the tree itself is edible. And what is that? Have an omer, I would say. This is pepper tree. I haven't tasted it, but apparently the wood of pepper tree itself tastes spicy. The bark, yeah, something of the tree itself. I don't know if the whole actual tree, but something of the tree itself, maybe it's the bark, but something of the tree itself has a taste of this spice. Now, what does that mean to you? The Lamdacha, this teaches you that peppercorn trees, chayavim ba'arla, are obligated in this prohibition of leaving it alone for 3 years. That's the first thing it teaches you. Right? It's telling you to, in other words, the verse says that you should leave fruit alone. How do you classify a fruit? Is a peppercorn treated as a fruit or not? Now I know the answer is yes. Because the verse includes trees whose wood tastes like its fruit. And this is a reference to peppercorn trees. And thus I know it's part of the class of fruits, which have to be treated with this prohibition of being left alone for 3 years. Clear? That's the first statement that we learn from here. The second thing is, we also learn that Eretz Yisrael lacks for nothing. It even grows peppercorn trees, because this prohibition of Arla only applies in Eretz Yisrael. As the verse reads, like Techser Kalba, you will not be lacking for anything when you get to Eretz Yisrael. Right, but the point is that, okay, without the verse, I would have thought that it's not considered a fruit. It doesn't classify as a fruit because I can't take it off the tree and eat it like that. It's too spicy. So it doesn't qualify as a fruit. And now that I see that the verse is talking about, I would have thought so, had the verse not included it specifically by saying that we're including a tree whose bark tastes like it's fruit. So I know to include it. Right. That's correct. Now, what does that mean? If the verse is explicitly incorporating it as a food, then Yom Kippur, when I eat it, I should also be liable. And we said earlier, Rava said that if I eat pepper, I don't eat it because it doesn't qualify as a food. But our mayor just told us that there's a whole verse that's there specifically just to tell us that this is considered a food. There's the challenge to Rava's position. Says the Gemara, like Kasha, this is not a contradiction. Habir tifta, habir vashta. Here, when we say that peppercorn is edible, he's talking about fresh peppercorn, which is still moist and therefore edible. But later, when it's dried out, it becomes too spicy, cannot be eaten. And that is what Rabbi meant when he said that eating peppercorn, one is exempt or not liable on Yom Kippur because it's too dried out and too spicy. Yeah, but it's more, It's probably like a sharp berry, I imagine. I've never seen non-dried out peppercorns. I wouldn't know. Do a field trip. Okay. Amen Ravina Rav Meimar. Ravina said to Rav Meimar, Va'amar Rav Nachman. But Rav Nachman said, now we're challenging the statement Rava said with respect to ginger, before we challenge the statement on pepper, and we distinguish between pepper that's fresh and therefore edible versus dried out and inedible, unless it's mixed with other foods because it's spice. Now Ravina tells Rav Meimar a challenge to Rava's position about ginger from that which Rav Nachman said. The Omer Rav Nachman said, Hi Himilta, this dish made of ginger, the Atim Mibe Handoi, which comes from India, some Indian dish made of ginger, but is cooked. Sharia, it is permissible to eat, and one should not be concerned with the issue of a non-Jew cooking one's food. And the reason is because it could have been eaten raw, even uncooked. And the bracha one makes is by the piyadama, because it's a fruit that comes from the ground. So now this also implies that ginger can also be eaten. Now, the way we've just read it based on Rashi, the implication is that you could even eat it raw, not just cooked. You could even eat it raw, which is why he's not concerned with the issue of a non-Jew eating it, a non-Jew cooking it. The issue of a non-Jew cooking it is only when the non-Jew is required for your edibility. But in this case, it's not, because you could have eaten it before the non-Jew cooked it, because you can eat it raw. So it says the Gemara like Kasha, again, this is not a question. Here, when we say it's edible, it's when it's still fresh and moist and therefore edible. But when it's dried out, it is therefore inedible. Sorry? Who wants to join the Gemara? Okay. Tan Rabbanan. Okay, we saw this in the Shulchan Aruch, by the way. The difference between dried out spices versus fresh spices that are more edible. Should I be concerned? Sorry? It's okay. Okay, Tan Rabbanan. Our sages taught, Mishnayik H text, Achal alekanim, if one ate branches or of stalk, like like weeds. Leaves are reeds. Ale is reeds, kind of reeds. Okay. Pater is exempt, not a normal food to be eaten. Lulavik fanim, the branches of the vine, chayav, one is liable for eating them, which means the branches of the vine are apparently edible food. And says the Gemara, Elu hein lo b'kfanim. What exactly are these edible branches of the vine? Amar Rav Yitzchak Migdala, Rav Yitzchak of Migdal says, anything which has sprouted between Rosh Hashanah and Kippur, is only 10 days prior to your eating it. It is therefore soft enough to be eaten. But Rav Kana says, all 30 days prior to Yom Kippur, it's still considered fresh and therefore edible. After that, too dried out and can't be eaten. We have a Mishnah H text which backs up the position of Rabbi Yitzchak of Midai following, where there it says, if one ate leaves of reeds, potter is exempt because it's not edible food. But if one ate branches of the vine, chayav, they're liable. And that very same Mishnah H text continues and qualifies. What exactly do we consider edible branches of the vine? Anything that has sprouted between Hashanah and Kippur, only for 10 days after it sprouts, is it edible? And this backs up the position of Rabbi Yitzchak of Migdal rather than the position of Rav Kana, who said that 30 days after it sprouts, it's still edible. Okay. We just made a distinction between dried out versus moist, the same thing as the pepper. Yeah, but the way I explained it based on Rashi was that we're talking about moist because it's still fresh from the ground. There are others who understand it to mean that the issue is after it's cooked. And when we say here wet, it means wet because it's been cooked and pickled, which is the way we eat ginger. When they serve you ginger with sushi, it's edible because they pickled it. Right? So certainly, I would imagine, halachically speaking, both of these things apply. Because the point is it's edible. So if it's edible as a pickled dish, then one would be liable. It's a dish that one pays for. Right? One orders sushi and asks them, can you please give me the ginger? Right? But dried out hard ginger is inedible. So I imagine you can learn the Gemara both ways, even though we learned the Gemara to mean that it's moist because it's still fresh from the ground. But you could also learn it that it means it's because we asked with respect to this Indian dish. The Indian dish is cooked. But what do we derive from the Indian dish? Do we derive that it's edible after it's being cooked? And that's the question? Or as Rashi said, we derive from the fact that Rav Nachman said you don't have to worry about the non-Jew cooking it because it's edible even before you cooked. And there's the question. The question comes on its edibility. In other words, the fact that it's edible after you cook, nobody questions that. The question is only, is it edible before it's cooked? And therefore comes the chidush that when it's still fresh, yes, it is edible even before it's cooked. Freshly picked ginger eaten as is. Have you tried eating it? I've never seen it. I've only ever seen ginger bought in the store. So either it's dried out or it's pickled. Yeah. So you could eat it. Yeah. Right. So the only ginger I've ever seen is either pickled or completely dried out. I haven't seen fresh, moist pickled. And he says you only have 10 days anyway. Oh no. No, that's what the branches from the vine. Doesn't say anything about how long it takes to dry this out. I guess it takes everybody. It's all dependent on what you do. Yeah, convention. Okay. A few more lines on the subject, and then tomorrow we'll get to the issue of educating children and preparing them to fast in Kippur. So we quote the Mishnah which says one who drinks brine, that heavily dense salt water, or fish brine, potter is exempt because they are not edible foods in themselves. Says the Gemara, the implication of the Mishnah is hachaimitz, but vinegar chayav, one is obligated. Why? From the very fact that vinegar is not on the list, it should have said brine, fish brine, or vinegar. But it only says brine or fish brine, doesn't mention anything about vinegar. The implication is that one who drinks vinegar is liable. And if the Gemara has to ask, who is the person? Who is the sage? Which is of the view that vinegar is an actual drinkable drink. And vinegar those days was not diluted like you buy it in the store. It's very strong, as we're going to learn in a moment. Maslisan says the Gemara, therefore our Mishnah must be mani. Who does this follow? We must say Rabbi. We must say that Rabbi is the one who authored the statement that vinegar is an edible food, an edible drink, consumable drink. The Tanya, we have learned in the Mishnah H text, Rabbi says, Chaimitz, vinegar, meishiv es nefesh. restores one's soul, literally. As Rashi explains it, a person who's starving and takes a sip of vinegar will feel refreshed. So even if it isn't an edible food and that people don't sit around the table and drink cups of vinegar, but nonetheless, the experience of drinking vinegar will take off the edge of your hunger. Just take a shot of that vinegar and you'll feel good. You'll feel revived. And if the issue of inui, the issue of self-inflicting pain, and the threshold for culpability, right? The threshold for culpability, which is the size of a date, was because we determined that's the amount required. Or, I'm sorry, a liquid is the size of the amount to take to a half a cheekful, right? And the reason why we came with that number is because the sages have determined that that's how much one has to drink to take off the edge of one's thirst. So if this is going to do the job, even if it's not a normal drink, still should be liable. So I don't know that Rabbi is suggesting that chaymer, that vinegar is a normal drink. I think it just means that for the purposes of violating Yom Kippur and that taking off the edge of the fast, this does it. And therefore there's liability. Okay, Darash of Gidol bar Menashe. Rav Gidol and Menashe expounded. Bibiri Denarish, in a place called Biri Denarish. I think I'm pronouncing that right. He said, Ein halacha karabi. The halacha is not like Rabbi. Meaning to say, one who drinks vinegar is not liable from Kippur because it's not consumable drink. So the halacha does not follow Rabbi, who said that because vinegar restores your sense of self, takes off the edge of hunger, you're liable. Rav Gidol says, we don't follow that. Leshana the next year, Nafki Kula Alman, the whole people, the whole community went out, Mazgu, they poured for themselves a glass of vinegar, diluted it in some water, Vishasu, and they were drinking it on Yom Kippur because he said the halacha doesn't follow your Rebbe. Sorry? Maybe you should have been more explicit in stating that it's forbidden, but still. Sorry? They should have understood that, or he should have been more explicit. I don't know, either way. Anyway, yeah. Bottom line is, sorry? No. So there's no, one second. So, they were drinking it on Yom Kippur, they were enjoying it themselves. Shomer Rav Gidl heard, then became very upset. Amar, he said, when I said this, the Yevid, I only said this that if someone drank it, is exempt. Did I say everybody should go around drinking vinegar? When did I say this? Anna, porta, a little bit of vinegar. That one is exempt if one drank a little bit of vinegar, meaning less than a cheekful. Tuva, drinking glasses full of vinegar. Did I say that you are exempt? Meaning, because it would seem then that Rabbi, so it would seem then that Rabbi is saying that even a little bit you're liable because it restores it takes off the edge of your thirst, even if you drank a little bit. And King Rav Gidl and said, no, only if you drink enough for culpability. Yeah. And Imrid Amriyana, when did I say that there's an exemption for drinking chai? If it were raw vinegar, undiluted, then it's way too much. But mazug, if it's been diluted, did I say? Which means if Gidl would say that diluted vinegar, you're liable. Does that mean even if you drink less than the required amount? I don't think so. When we learned in Shulchan Aruch, it said you still have to drink that amount. That's a good question. Why does Rabbi Gidl make the distinction between a little and a lot? Why does he make the distinction? Walk it through. When I said that you're exempt only if you drink a little, how much? Didn't say how much is little. Under the threshold? If it's under the threshold, that would mean diluted vinegar under the threshold, you're liable, according to Rav Gidl. That wasn't the case in the halacha. So what exactly is this distinction between little and a lot that Rav Gidl is making? Good question. I hadn't considered that when I read this Gemara first. I thought that, I just figured it means a little less than the required amount versus more than the required amount. And that less than the required amount, Rabbi was saying you're still liable because it restores takes away the edge of your thirst. But then combining that with the later statement would mean there's a different standard for vinegar if it's diluted because that's not the halacha. I don't know, what does a gidul mean? Unless he's just speaking out in his making overemphasizing his point of how upset he is that people are taking advantage of this. There's a possibility, but the Gemara is recording it. It means the Gemara is recording it because the Gemara is teaching us something. So it's very precise. Good question. I don't know the answer to that. Why does a gidul make this distinction between a little and a lot? And exactly what's the difference between a little and a lot? At which threshold does it go from a little to a lot? If it's not the threshold of half a cheekful, which is culpability. Very good question. I don't know the answer. Okay. I'll have to think on that and look into some of the commentaries. All right, have a wonderful day. Tomorrow we get into the halachas of children, preparing children in the years before their bar and bat mitzvah for Yom Kippur.